Well, it is 9:41, and I guess we should start. Daniel, are you prepared with an opening prayer, or I have got a little something I can read?
I am not prepared.
Okay, well, here we go, everybody. I'm going to read the third verse of I Sing a Song of the Saints of God, which I remember from high school days. The saints lived not only in ages past, there are hundreds of thousands still. The world is bright with the joyous saints who love to do Jesus' will. You can meet them in school or in lanes or at sea, in church or in trains or in shops or at tea. But the saints of God are just folk like me, and I mean to be one too. Amen. Okay, now I'm going to mute everybody, mute all, and then.
I haven't asked.
Yeah. All right, and then unmute.
Yeah, I got it.
All right, let's see. Is that how I do it? Hang on.
Hey, this is the last week of Faith and Function this spring. So thanks everybody. This is the last Zoom we're going to do for probably a long time. There's no class next week. And then in 2 weeks, we start in-person Sunday school at 9:40 at the church and on live stream, just like regular church, with actually with Joshua Narciss from the Church Health Center. He's actually coming back to teach. So he's got the, then we go through the summer. So hope to see everybody there or virtually with live stream. It's going to be the same sort of sign up thing as for regular church. All right, that's it.
Yeah, so I gave you a preamble of Joshua then. I guess I didn't ask him, are you teaching Faith and Function in a couple of weeks? I didn't know that. So.
I don't think he was scheduled when he came in.
Okay, good. Well, you came to feel what an incredibly powerful young man he is. So, yeah, y'all will like him in person even more. Would you like for me to just get started, Minna? Yeah, great. So, when I was asked to talk with y'all, I was sort of given the suggestion of talking about the communion of saints. But then there was, or anything else you would like to talk about. So I've sort of shot my wad talking about saints just 2 weeks ago, but that's all I got. So I'm going to go with, or anything else you'd like to talk about. So, there's two things really that I feel competent to talk about. One is the Bible, and the other is the link between faith and health. So I think most of y'all, I've never really, hopefully some of you may have heard me talk about faith and health and really the work of church health, but I just thought I would maybe focus more on that and really to talk about the history of the church and from a biblical perspective, why we should care about our bodies and why we should, be engaged in a healing ministry. That, again, that's what church health is all about. So I hope you're okay with that. Feel free to interrupt me at any point. But yeah, just if we look at the Bible, it begins in Genesis where God creates Adam and Eve, and it is only when God breathes the breath of life, the ruach, the dust of the earth, into their form that they become fully human. So it is only when we are dust and breath that we are fully human. There is no, from a biblical standpoint, separation between body and spirit. The entire biblical witness is that body and spirit are one. So one of the things that we have come to, unfortunately, in my opinion, as Christians, sometimes live into is that our bodies are the home of our spirit or our soul. And we look forward to the time when those things are separated. and that when we die, our spirit leaves our bodies and goes to heaven or to the eternal. The problem with that idea is that that is not a biblical idea. That idea is fully grounded in Plato. Plato viewed our bodies as being the prison house of the soul, and that within each of us, there's a spark of the divine. And when we die, we are shed of our bodies, and which allows that spark of the divine to return to the divine. Much of the Bible is spent completely trying to move away from that idea. The biblical witness is always body and spirit are one. And when we get to the New Testament about this issue, Paul in particular rants and raves against this Platonic concept. And if you think about our own creeds, our own way of viewing this, what do we believe in? We believe in the resurrection of the body. And the way Paul writes about it, and look, don't shoot the messenger here, y'all. I'm just trying to tell you what the biblical witness is. So what Paul says, which is where most of the New Testament theological position on this comes from, is that when we die, we are dead. And we are dead, and then the idea of the resurrection occurs when? At the second coming. And it is at the second coming that those who died in the Lord are first resurrected, and then the rest of us are resurrected. But it is only at that point that we have the resurrection of the dead, both body and spirit. That is what the Bible says. That there is really no position in the New Testament that says when we die, we are freed from this burden of our bodies. Now, to give you some sense of comfort about this, a lot of this has to do with our perception of time. So we actually experience time in two ways. One is what we're doing right now. This is called chronos. It is, 12 till 10, and I'm going to keep talking. I'm sure some of you are going, really, for another 30 or 40 minutes. But that experience, moment to moment to moment, is chronos. And that can feel like an eternity for various times. However, if I were to tell you right this minute, go back to your 10th birthday, most of us could do that like that in a flash, right? So that experience of time is called chronos. And chronos takes us from one high moment to the next. So if you die tomorrow, the next experience of time in chronos would come in a flash, and it would be at the resurrection. This is the New Testament understanding of how this works. Now, I just want to emphasize the fact that, and I'm going to talk more about this, the impact of Platonic thinking on Christian theology has been incredibly intense, and yet it's not exactly what the Bible tells us. So at the end of the end of day, it may be that when we die, our souls and our spirits, go to connect to the eternal. That may turn out to be right. But if it is right, it means that Plato is who's right, and Paul and Jesus and the New Testament witness is wrong, because that is not what the New Testament says. All right. So I make that point just to emphasize from the Christian perspective how important it is to see the body and the spirit as one. And caring for the body is unbelievably important, because in Genesis, with the creation of the body and the spirit and humanity, the body is declared not just to be good, but to be very good. Now, skipping in the New Testament, this is why Jesus is so intimately involved in a healing ministry. Jesus, in many ways, is seen more as a healer than he is almost anything else. I mean, what attracts people to Jesus is not his preaching, it's that he is viewed as a healer. Now, when we look at the authors of the New Testament, I just want to talk for a minute about Luke, Acts. So we know the same person writes both Luke and Acts. The first book is talking about Jesus. The second book is talking about what it means to follow Jesus. So I personally think that the point of this is not about telling us the story of Jesus. Everybody already knows the story of Jesus at the time Luke is writing. The real purpose of this is to answer the question of what does it mean to follow Jesus? So in Luke, there are primarily three things that Jesus does. He preaches, he teaches, and he heals. He also raises people from the dead, but the focus is to preach, teach, and heal. On the healing side, in Luke, there are 17 recorded acts of healing that Jesus does. Now, Acts is all about following suit as to what would it mean to follow Jesus. So the book of Acts is built around two primary characters, Peter and Paul. They are clearly very, very different. Their personalities are extremely different. And yet, as we follow them along in the narrative, there's three things they do. They preach, they teach, and they heal. So there are actually 19 recorded acts of healing in Acts that the disciples do, not Jesus, the disciples. Now, there's also this issue of raising the dead. So Luke is trying to make it clear that if you are going to follow Jesus, you need to do what Jesus does. So in order to make it crystal clear, one of my favorite stories in the Bible is that Paul, who's clearly a very long-winded preacher, is preaching this very long sermon. The church is crowded, and there's this young man sitting in a window who is listening, and in this long-winded sermon, he falls asleep. When he falls asleep, he falls out of the window and is dead. And it's incumbent on Paul to go and raise him from the dead. So one thing I think y'all should point out to David almost immediately is that if he takes to becoming a long-winded preacher, he needs to be totally prepared to raise people from the dead. If he's not doing that, then he needs to keep the sermons short. That's just an aside. All right. So what is it this healing is all about? Besides the Luke Acts narrative, in Timothy, Paul tells Timothy to take a little wine for his stomach that ails him. Now, Paul is not telling Timothy, get a little buzz on and you'll feel better. Instead, Paul is using a Greek medical technique that is probably not today good advice, but he's using the best of science that is available to him at that point in order to care for the body as well as the spirit. And then in James, James says, is any among you sick? Then let them call for the elders, the leaders of the church, and you are to anoint them with oil. Now, we think of that anointing these days as something we do ceremonially, but again, it's not that at all. It is a Greek medical technique that is used in a lot of different ways. You know, my point being is that the New Testament fully embraces science. or wherever we are in the state of this art, to use those skills for the purpose of living out what it would mean to follow Jesus. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you want to follow Jesus, you have to do all three things: to preach, to teach, and to heal. You do not get to take a pass on the healing part. You don't get to say, I will let the people who wear white coats be the ones who do the healing. If you're doing that, then you're ignoring personally a third of the Bible. So do you really want to, at the end of time, look God in the face and have God say to you, did you think I was kidding about that part? Anyway, so the church in the early years takes this unbelievably seriously. So how do we go from, at the end of writing the New Testament, there's really just a handful of Christians, right? There's not a plethora of them. There's just a relatively small number. But by the time we get to the early 4th century, and Constantine is the ruler of Rome, he decides that the writing's on the wall, and he makes Christianity the state religion of Rome. That's a relatively short period of time to do that. So why does he do that? Now, most preachers will tell you it had to be because of great preaching. Preaching had nothing to do with it. During the 2nd and 3rd century, there are plagues all over the Roman world, maybe COVID. And when people get sick, it is only the Christians who are willing to take care of them. And when people get sick, when they get better from their illness, they ask the question, who is your God that I might follow him? That is what grows the church. That is what ultimately makes Christianity the state religion. Now, I'm not going to talk about this for 2,000 years, but let's just look at our country. So prior to the Civil War, if you were sick, the most likely person anybody would have seen for healthcare was actually a pastor. Pastors provided virtually all the healthcare there is in this country. Now, again, I think we all hope David's going to end up being a great pastor for Idlewild, but I'm guessing you didn't hire him in order to be your doctor. You know, sometimes the thought of going to see a preacher when you're sick is a little unnerving. But in the early part of this country, that's exactly what we did. Partly because the pastor was the most learned person in the community, but also because it's how we took this stuff seriously. To give you 2 examples. One, Cotton Mather, who most people think of as a hellfire and brimstone preacher in the colonial period. Mather is actually the person who initiates the idea of inoculations, you might say vaccines. Mather developed a path to inoculate people in the 17th century against smallpox, and he inoculates the entire city of Boston against smallpox. He is considered to be the first significant figure in American medicine. Now, interesting enough, the way we inoculate the military today against smallpox is the exact same way Mather did it in the 17th century. Now, you could then say that the fact that we have a vaccine for COVID right now is directly related to Cotton Mather. Now, one thing just to point out to you, Jonathan Edwards, who many Presbyterians would argue is the greatest theologian America's ever had. Edwards ultimately gets this vaccine against smallpox that Mather created. And the one little small problem is that the vaccine actually killed him. But in the world of medicine and science, I can assure you that you lose one theologian, it's not considered to be a great loss. And for that reason, we can still hold up Mather for what he did. All right. The other person to tell you about, who's near and dear to my heart, and I hope at some level to yours, is John Wesley. So John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, actually thought of himself as a pastor, as a physician. Wesley practiced medicine from the day he was 19 until he died. He wrote several books on healthcare. His book, Primitive Physics, which is a self-help healthcare manual, was so successful on the American frontier that as late as 1860, if we were in Memphis in 1860, there would have been a greater chance of you having a copy of Wesley's book, Primitive Physics, than you would your own copy of the Bible. Now, I fully confess Wesley had some unusual ideas. He had at least 19 different cures for baldness, most of which I have tried myself. Now, my favorite is you take a big red onion, you cut it in half, and then you rub it on your head until it turns red, and then you put honey on it. Now, if that doesn't work, you could use Wesley's tried and true method for anything, which is you can electrify it. Wesley actually saw a demonstration of static electricity that was put on by Benjamin Franklin in London. And he was so enamored with the idea that he went home and in his garage, he created a little thing he called an electrifier. And if you read his diaries, he used it virtually every day. So he would use it for anything from colds to serious illnesses, no matter what. If anything else didn't work, Wesley would say, electrify it. Now, it's not as crazy as it sounds. If somebody falls down dead right now, you probably want us to put a little electricity through your heart. Electricity is actually extremely important in medicine today. I would argue that we have not fully understood the importance of electricity. We have spent way too much time focusing on chemistry. So we give people pills that are designed to deal with parts of our bodies, our brains, our hearts, our muscles that are totally electrical units. So we use chemistry to try to deal with electrical problems. That's why the pills don't work. Anyway, more to the point, Wesley in the 18th century was the primary advocate against the use of polypharmacy. In the 18th century, it was generally thought the more drugs, the better, which sounds a little bit like the 21st century. Instead, Wesley believed in clean air, fresh water, more exercise. Now, we'll confess, Wesley thought that riding a horse would cure almost anything. Wesley personally rode a horse for 2 hours every day for over 70 years. If it was raining or for whatever reason he couldn't get outside, he had created a thing in his living room where he would bounce up and down on it, simulating riding a horse. Now, he was against the use of leeching, bleeding, the use of quicksilver. Instead, he thought there should be real evidence to demonstrate that something was effective before we employed it, and he thought prevention was always more important than treatment. So I don't know if you ever think of it this way, but Wesley and George Washington are contemporaries. And if you know how Washington died, it was December 4th. He's walking around Mount Vernon looking to decide which trees he thinks needs to be felled during the winter, and he gets sick. We now know he probably had something called epiglottitis, but they bring the best doctors in America to come take care of him. And their collective decision was that they bled him of 5 units of blood and he died. Now, had they called Wesley, he would have never let that happen. Instead, he would have probably gotten him up on his horse and ridden him around Mount Vernon. It might not have helped, but it wouldn't have killed him. All right, so Wesley was primarily, yeah, you got a question, Minna?
So you do have 2 physicians here, Linda Freeland and Janice Wood. And I'm not sure who CDA pad 3 is, but you got some doctors here.
Okay, good. I'm not sure if y'all heard all these stories here, but I don't know if if you got a better cure for baldness than Wesley, but anyway, Dr. Wood, she might particularly have a cure for baldness. I need that. Please share that with me when I'm done. Anyway, Wesley practiced medicine primarily in caring for the coal miners of Western England. But when he came to America, even though he was not a very successful evangelist, in Wesley's 2 years in Georgia, he did not convert one person, not one. However, his ideas around healthcare actually caught on. They spread all over the country until as late as 1863, a pastor in Guilford, Connecticut wrote the standard textbook of physiology for the entire country. So what happened? Because what I just described is not the way it is in America today. So 3 main things I think are what led to where things are right now. Number 1, the split between science and religion that comes about because of Darwin. We should never underestimate the influence of Darwin. It's been profound. We experience it virtually every day. The second, during the late 19th and early 20th century, there is an explosion of medical science. There's a lot of new medicine that's better than Wesley's folk remedies. However, still no cure for baldness. But along with this new science, there arises a new profession that is known as medicine. It is seen as financially lucrative. It makes sense to keep the clergy out, and the truth is, the clergy are too lazy to keep up with all the new knowledge. And then the third thing, which is really, I think, the most important thing, which I've alluded to already, which is during the late 19th and early 20th century, there is a reassertion of this philosophical idea known as Cartesian dualism. This idea that starts with Descartes, but is a recapitulation of Plato, that says we can take a human being and separate us into a body and a spirit. We put the body on one side and say it's the purview of science and medicine. We put the spirit on the other and say it's okay for the church to mess around with people's spirits, but heaven forbid it cross this line and actually care about our bodies. As I've already said, this is a fundamentally non-Christian, non-Jewish, non-Muslim, non-Hindu idea. And yet this idea rules the day. I can give you plenty of examples of this, but what happens every day in emergency rooms is people come to the emergency room with a pain in their chest, and they describe it as a pain in their heart. They go to the emergency room, we do all these tests, they can end up with a cardiac catheterization, we can do an MRI of their chest, and it's all normal. And we tell the person there's nothing wrong with you. And the reason that we tell them that is because you can MRI somebody's chest all day long, and you will never know what a broken heart looks like. We try to treat matters of the spirit with drugs that don't work. And medicine, doctors are not taught how to deal with fundamentally spiritual problems. And as a result, we end up making mistakes at every turn. On the other side of this, the best example I could give you is that the least healthy meal you could eat every week is at a church. Our churches have blessed the sin of gluttony for the sake of fellowship. In the midst of the obesity epidemic in America, clergy are actually 20% heavier than the rest of the population. You can't have a healthy church if you don't have healthy leaders. Anyway, church health is all built around trying to find a way to reconnect these. The mission of church health is to care for our bodies as well as our spirits, and to care for the people working to make our lives comfortable, healthier. So one other component just to talk about is how did we end up with all these hospitals that have church names on them? You know, all over this country, we have built hospitals with church names on them, but they have almost nothing to do with worshiping congregations. You know, I'm sure you know that there are plenty of Presbyterian hospitals in other cities around the country, but what do they have to do with the Presbyterian Church, and how did it get that way? So going back to the turn of the 20th century, with all this new knowledge that I talked about, theologically, there arose something called the social gospel movement, led by a guy named Walter Rauschenbusch. Under the social gospel movement, what was advocated is that all this new knowledge should be available to everybody, including the poor. And as a result, churches took on themselves to build hospitals that would be for everybody around this country. So the hospitals were built using the resources of the church. And if you go look at virtually every hospital in America that has a church name on them, Baptist and Methodist are no exceptions. They were built between 1900 and roughly 1930. So during this time frame, the churches ran the hospitals with the resources of the church. However, people of means, wealthy people, may have contributed to it, but said, hey, that's all well and good. You can have your hospitals, but we are going to get our health care the way we always have. The doctor is going to come to my house to take care of me. So it worked that way until in the 1930s, people actually looked at the data and they came to realize that people did better in the hospitals than they did with getting Marcus Welby to come to your home. So people of means came to the church to change the formula and said, look, we want the church to keep funding this, but we will run the hospitals for you. And the church said, okay. It worked that way until the 1950s, at which point the hospitals are losing money hand over fist. The hospitals come to the church and say, hey guys, remember, you own us and we need more money to run the hospitals. The church says, not on your life. And the churches build a firewall financially between the hospitals and the churches, at which point a new profession is created, that of hospital administrator. And the hospital administrators are given the charge to run the hospital successfully. They struggle mightily until in 1965, they are given a gift from God. Anybody know what that gift would have been in 1965?
Medicare?
The advent of Medicare and Medicaid. That's exactly right. And so with all this federal dollars that flow into the hospitals are making money hand over fist, that they are literally putting money into closets. At this point, the church comes back and says, hey guys, remember, we own you and we want to share with all your money. But that firewall that the church built is now impenetrable, at which point it's the hospitals who say, not on your life. When we get to the 1980s, churches are asking, what is the purpose of our owning these hospitals? You know, we get no benefit from it and there's still a potential for liability. So all over the country, the hospitals are sold off to for-profit endeavors. You know, HCA, Tenet, this is how St. Francis gets owned by a for-profit endeavor. I can assure you, St. Francis himself would be turning over in his grave with his statue in front of a tenant-owned hospital. But the money that goes from the sale of the hospital gets put into what are known as conversion foundations. So here in Memphis, the Assisi Foundation is one of them. Those hospitals, those conversion foundations, at first, the money is used, again, for the purpose of how the hospitals were created, primarily to provide money to help care for the poor. But quickly, the boards of the conversion foundations broadened to have a community focus, and the foundations start funding anywhere from the ballet to the opera, things that have nothing to do with healthcare for the poor. Finally, where you get to today, when you look at the hospital's ability and willingness to provide healthcare for the poor, remember, these church-owned hospitals, church-named hospitals, were created for the sole purpose of providing healthcare for the poor. Today, nationally, you could say that the church-owned hospitals do 100% more healthcare for the poor than the for-profit hospitals, and you would be right. You could also argue, is there really that much difference between 2% and 1%, which is nationally the numbers that the church named hospitals do around what is referred to as indigent healthcare. The point of this whole story is back to number one, when it comes to the hospitals, how did the church let this happen? But the bigger point is to ask, in today's world, how do we reclaim that? You know, at Idlewild, how do we reclaim a healthcare ministry? One of the things that I have witnessed is COVID has actually made us start to think again about what is the church's role in issues around health and caring for our bodies. You know, we had gotten away from that almost completely, but now we actually have an opportunity. And what I would say to you at Idlewild is this an opportunity for evangelism? Remember how the church grew in the first place. It was when there were plagues in the Roman world, and it was the Christians who reached out to care for people. And when they got better, who is your God? You know, we now have an opportunity to completely rethink church. And church cannot just be about our buildings. You know, the Christian, particularly the Protestant church, is bleeding every way it can possibly bleed. And we are focused on those things that may not really matter. But if we could focus on the things that actually change people's lives, and we could remember what we are called to do in order to follow Jesus, which includes having a healing ministry, we would have the chance to reinvigorate and infuse new life into the church, which in many cases right now is dying. All right, let me stop, and we got a few minutes. I'm happy to answer any questions, or we can just talk about that. You can tell me you think I'm crazy, or you wouldn't be the first. I'd love to hear what the doctors have to say about any of that. All right, you'll have to unmute to say that. I can't believe nobody has any thoughts about that.
I'll say what I said last week. There's only like 9 or 10 of us in this call. So if you have something to say, you don't have to wait for anybody else.
Right. Well, let me then I'll go on and talk about how Church Health has tried to take that seriously, because, you know, Church Health started in 1987. I came to Memphis because I literally read somewhere that Memphis was the poorest major city in America. That, you know, I grew up in Atlanta. I had never set foot in Memphis, and I came here totally selling out of an empty cart, just knocking on doors. with an idea about how to live into what I just described. You know, what would any of that look like in today's world? So the purpose of Church Health from 1987 until today is to try to help all of our congregations take everything I just said seriously in the way it works today. And so our focus then, as it is now, was to try to care for people who fell through the crack. So in 1987, there were 26 million uninsured Americans. How did we get to have that many people who were uninsured, almost all of whom were working in low-wage jobs, and their job didn't offer them health insurance? So we got to ask the question, how did insurance come about in the first place? So during World War II, as all the young men were, for the most part, engaged in fighting the war, there was a wage freeze that the government put on around businesses all over the country. So you could not entice somebody to come work for your business by offering them more money. But people were creative, and what they started offering were benefits. One of which being the rise of Blue Cross and Blue Shield as way to offer healthcare benefits. And that became a strong incentive for people to come work for a business. When the war is over, as you're trying to attract the young men to come work, that healthcare benefit continued. So throughout the 70s, throughout the 50s, you would have people working in businesses that now had this benefit. But Medicare comes along, and you are now able to provide health care for the elderly and disabled, and then Medicaid. So most people don't really understand the nature of Medicaid. So Medicaid is always thought as providing health care for the poor. And early on, that is pretty much how it played itself out. And so after 1965, you have three sources of insurance, if you will, through Blue Cross and Blue Shield and similar organizations, Medicare and Medicaid. And for one brief moment, America came very close to having universal health care. That is, as a result of that, it's when signs went up in doctors' offices all over the country that said payment is expected at the time of service. So prior to 1965, 1/3 of every doctor's practice was expected to be charity care. That's how it worked. In Memphis, the Gaylor Clinic and the City of Memphis Hospital were not staffed and run by medical students and residents primarily. It's private doctors were giving a day that they were expected to go to care for the poor. That was the nature of how it worked. And doctors were paid in chickens. But after 1965, when it is assumed that everybody has health insurance, then that is no longer needed, or so it was thought, and being paid becomes the expectation that every doctor has. However, very quickly, there become gaps in the system, and it's primarily with the limitations of Medicaid. So even today, in order to qualify for Medicaid or TennCare, it is not an income-based issue. You first have to meet what is called a categorical criteria. You have to be blind, disabled, over 65, or a child with, or a single mother who's pregnant. What that means is anybody who's under 65, who's working, who isn't one of those categorical criteria, meaning blind, disabled, over 65, or a child or a single mother. If you take away every penny that person ever has. They never have a chance to earn another cent for the rest of their life. They won't qualify for Medicaid because they don't meet one of those categorical criteria. So as a result, the working poor, if you will, between 1965 and 1987, when church health began, this gap of being uninsured grows. And that continues to be the case, especially in Tennessee, where after the Affordable Care Act happens, nothing happens for Tennessee. You know, a lot of people assume that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, solves the problem, but I assure you, in Tennessee, it has not. The Affordable Care Act is based on two premises. Number one, all 50 states expand Medicaid. Now, the expansion of Medicaid means that it would become an income-based program. We would do away with the categorical criterias, and based on if your income is below a certain level, you will now get the Medicaid insurance. However, Tennessee, in the wisdom of our legislature, has chosen not to do that. The other piece of Obamacare is the exchange. We've all heard about the exchange. How the exchange works is it gives people the potential of purchasing health insurance in the open market. And so during open enrollment, you can go to the exchange, you put in your income information, you can now find a policy that works for you, and then the cost of that policy is subsidized by the federal government by taking that money off your income tax. And now it can become affordable. However, if you're in Tennessee today and you go to healthcare.gov, you put your income information in and you look to find a policy that you can afford if, and this is the big caveat, if your income is below, not above, below 138% of the poverty level. So what is that? That's roughly $12 an hour for a family of four. So currently, Church Health cares for over 70,000 people in Memphis. 70,000. 90% of our patients fall below 138% of the poverty level. So when they go to healthcare.gov, they put their income information in. Do you know what healthcare.gov says to them? It says you should apply for Medicaid in your state. Only Tennessee has an expanded Medicaid. Now, I know you probably think I got this wrong, or you weren't paying attention, or you're tired of listening to me talk. But what I just said to you is that the poorest people get nothing. Nothing. The impact of the Affordable Care Act on poor people in Tennessee has been nothing. Jesus said the poor will always be with you. So far, he's been right. I just don't think he ever thought there were going to be so many poor people. Again, this is, in my mind, where the church has to step up. So the mission of Church Health is to find a way for the church and people of faith to answer the call. You know, Church Health is not a federally funded anything. You know, we don't depend on the government because the government cannot do the work of the church. You know, our mission is not to solve the great social problems in America. We don't know how to do that. We're not trying to do that. What we're trying to do is help Idlewild figure out, how do I take seriously that call to discipleship, to preach, teach, and heal? What does that look like in today's world? That is our mission. And Idlewild has always been a partner with us in trying to make this happen. But, you know, that 70,000 people is the number we had before COVID. You know, in Memphis, during COVID, 100,000 people lost their job. When they lost their job, they lost their health insurance. When they get sick, what are they to do? Now, most of those people are now working again. However, they're working in that they have cobbled together 2 or 3 low-paying jobs that don't offer health insurance. So I'm not proud to tell you this, but we currently have 2,500 people on our new patient waiting list. That's a big number. And it's going to take us quite a while to get through that. But again, the only reason for me to tell you all of this has to do with the church. This is all about how does the church do this, even when the church itself is struggling. And I absolutely believe in my heart of hearts that this is a way for the church out of the a way for the church to get out of the struggles we are all facing. All right, one more chance to answer questions, but other than that, I'm tired of hearing myself talk. So.
Wow, you are a powerful voice.
I have a question.
Sure.
Scott, this is Carl. Awesome.
Carl, awesome.
Hey, I would love to be able to have those talking points. Is there any way that, I mean, just that last part, when you led me through the qualification, I had no idea that these people that you serve were receiving nothing. I'm still shocked at that. I knew something was up, but I didn't know it was that drastic. Is there a way that you could perhaps send me a link that succinctly tells me what I can tell people in casual conversation? Because I promise you, most of the people that I know are less informed than I am on this subject. And
Right.
I would love to be able to bring that issue up and be clear about it.
I will say, if you look in the
Sure.
upper corner, this session is recorded.
Oh, okay.
Right, so you could get a recording of it if you'll talk to
Okay. I'll do that. Thank you.
Good.
Great
Good, Carl.
information, Scott. Great.
Sure. Thanks. All right. Well, thanks for having me. I'm glad Joshua's going to join you in person in a couple of weeks. So looks like y'all are done with Zoom. So maybe we'll quickly get to where the whole world is.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah,
What,
sure.
I've heard that other groups from other cities have come to visit you and see what that model is like. How does that sort of got a life of its own? Can you talk about how it might have proliferated in other cities?
Sure. So we now have a para organization called ECHO. It stands for Empowering Church Health Opportunities. So we now have worked in 62 other communities to try to help them open clinics that are modeled after church health. What I believe is that the chaos in Washington around healthcare actually has opened an opportunity to create a national faith-based healthcare system. And we are trying to run through that door. So ECHO is our arm of having that happen. So there are 62 clinics that are open right now, and we're working in about 30 other communities around the country. And we're just going to see where this takes us.
Great.
Minna, yes? You're on mute.
Okay, if you all will click on chat down there, you notice that Daniel has sent you a link to the Idlewild YouTube channel, which is where this session was recorded. So anyway, anybody who wants to grab that.
They usually show up a couple days after.
Right. Okay.
And it's also, there's time with the younger church and sermons. It's good to have you back, Carl.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Made us think about our commitment, for sure. Thank you.
Well, Carl is one of the first people I ever met when I came to Memphis.
Man, I just never thought it would turn into this. Gracious. It's an empire.
I volunteer at the garden that Carl started in Binghamton. So his name is all over that, helping the folks in that neighborhood, the young people to, learn how to grow things and get paid for it. And he's done a great job over there.
Well, thank you.
Well, you want another verse of for all the saints here? You see.
Sounds good.
All right. Okay. This is second verse. They loved their Lord so dear, and God's love made them strong. They followed the right for Jesus' sake, the whole of their good lives long. Amen.
Great, y'all.
All right.
Take care. Have a good Sunday.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.